week, but there was this little thing called the election. Because people have told me over the years that we have every political spectrum of folks represented at the summit. And Transgender Law Center is a nonpartisan organization. And I will also say that we have a lot of opportunities over the next 4 years. We have come a long way, especially when it comes to federal protections over the last 2 years. And a lot of them have been quiet. They haven't been flashy. They may not have gotten a lot of attention, but they give us a lot to work with wherever we live in the United States. And so I want to talk about some of that today. And I do believe we're in a time that I wouldn't have estimated just a couple of years ago. I actually believe we're in a time when I can see the future of full employment protections for transgender people throughout the United States, and quite possibly the full health care that we need as well. That's pretty damn cool. So on the employment front, employment is really important to many of us because we know that transgender people have double the unemployment rate of the general population. And trans folk of color particularly have unemployment rates that are 4 times that of non-transgender people. It's criminal. The levels of employment discrimination we face are just out the roof. Anywhere from 70 to 90% of us have experienced employment discrimination at some point, which makes it really hard for us to take care of ourselves and our family. And many of you know this. You know this way too well. It means that many of us have to rely on the street economy in order to survive. We need more access to social services and the safety net, and unfortunately those are becoming more and more difficult to get. So employment protections are really important to a lot of the legal and the policy advocates in the trans movement, because we see that as one really important rung on the ladder to get to economic self-sufficiency and economic justice for trans and gender nonconforming people. This year we have a very big step forward. As some of you hopefully know, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued a decision in May of this year clarifying that transgender people are covered under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, in a couple minutes, I'm going to show you kind of what the state is of the different states and what states have passed different non-discrimination laws. What this EEOC decision means, though, is that any employer with 10 or more, is it 15? 15 or more employees have to comply with federal employment protections under the EEOC. And if transgender people are failed to hire, are not hired or are fired because they are transgender, they have recourse now. They can go file a complaint with their local EEOC office anywhere in the United States. This is a big deal. For a long time, people in Missouri, where I'm from, would have no recourse without state laws. We would have nothing to do, could not really do anything if we were fired merely because we came out as transgender or we were outed during a job interview. And now that's changed. Now this is only real if we act on it. We have to get the word out to our community that for people, especially the people who live in states where they don't have state protections, or people who are federal workers, that they actually have a new right, a new recourse that did not exist a year ago. And we also need to take this opportunity to do public education, I feel very strongly, to let employers know they are on the hook. It is time for them to make sure they've got good policies and practices to make sure that transgender people have equal access to employment. If not, they're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's one thing I'd love for you all to talk about this weekend as you're having conversations, especially for people outside of California. How do we make this real? How do we make sure people know that they have protections and there's something to do? Now we know it's not going to fix everything, but at least it creates a floor and gives us something to work with. Kara, remember to submit your time card by noon today. So it's a big deal. Now this isn't the only area that we've seen progress. Because of administrative changes made through the Obama administration over the last 4 years, we now have recourse when it comes to employment, but we also have language and guidance that says that there is no discrimination against transgender people in any HUD or Housing and Urban Development funded programs throughout the United States. And we've also gotten written communication from the government saying that transgender people should be covered under discrimination provisions under the Affordable Care Act as well. Just a year ago, if you looked at this map and said, okay, where do we have some sort of protections for transgender people, it would be very spotty. But we actually now have some basic protections across the board, regardless of where people live. It's really a game changer. We've got to figure out now, how do we use this? How do we make it real? Because, you know, a law is great, or a regulation is great when it's on paper, but it doesn't do anything unless people actually make complaints and educate the local housing provider, the local hospital, the local employer about the fact that they do have these rights and responsibilities, and to make those real. So I wanted to talk just for a minute about what's happened now, what we look like at the state-by-state level. And any of the T's are where we have employment non-discrimination laws covering sexual orientation and gender identity. The grays or greens or whatever the color might be, I'm a little colorblind, are without a T are where we have sexual orientation protections but not gender identity. So we need to go back and do some work there. And then the clear areas are the areas we do not have state protections. So those especially, you know, the Texas, Oklahoma, the Kansas, this area that is currently not colored in, really are going to depend on a lot of these federal regulations and EEOC rulings in order to make sure that they're able to have recourse. The states with the T are doing pretty well. And then Wisconsin, New York, New Hampshire, Delaware, Maryland, some of the states we've got to go back and do some additional work. Now, some states have already moved just in the last year. Massachusetts, you all had a good victory, yeah? Yeah! We are definitely continuing to see movement, and the National Center for Transgender Equality has been convening the states that have passed sexual orientation laws but not gender identity laws, and they're working together to fix this. But we still have a bit of a patchwork when it comes to employment protections outside of the EEOC ruling. Now, with the elections this week, and given where we are in the Senate, it seems to me, too, that our pathway to the passing an Employment Non-Discrimination Act are quite good as well. That there's a very good chance that we will actually have federal law to complement the EEOC ruling. Now, that, again, is going to depend on a lot of the folks in this room and around the country to do the education and get people out to actually pass this bill finally. But if we're not doing it the next 4 years, I don't know where we are. You think we can do that, Gunnar?
Oh, totally.
Yeah. I think so. And what I'd like to talk about with folks this weekend, too, is whether or not ENDA is enough. Because at this point, I would love for us to be talking about a global equality bill, making sure that we have non-discrimination protections for housing and employment and public accommodations and social services across the board. And I think it's the day to talk about that is here. In California and in some of the other states, we're actually now taking the next step too, and as of January, gender identity and gender expression are now in our state employment rights posters that are in every workplace. We were so happy. So even where we have good laws, we can still figure out how do we make sure that people are aware of these laws, the rights and responsibilities. In housing, in addition to the HUD rule saying that there is no discrimination against transgender people in HUD housing, we have a number of states that have passed good housing non-discrimination laws as well. As you may notice, those look really different, but very similar to the employment discrimination maps, and that's pretty consistent. The states now, most of them that have good employment non-discrimination laws also have good housing laws and some good other kinds of non-discrimination laws. And in a fair number of states now, we can change our birth certificate. In the majority, 26 states, we still have work to do in 21 states that make us just amend our birth certificate where, you know, you still have your birth name struck out with then your new name. It doesn't give us the same level of privacy as it has for the 26 states that give you a new birth certificate. But we still have a few states like Ohio, Tennessee, and Idaho that won't give you any new birth certificate. So we've got a lot of work to do there. We're also seeing a movement to changing birth certificate laws to eliminate the surgery requirement so that people no longer have the medical and the financial barriers to getting a birth certificate or legal gender change that matches who that we are. And I think we've got a really good opportunity to continue to push that. But we still have a lot of challenges, as we're all too aware of. Brandy Martell, for example, who had been an outreach worker at Tri-City Health here in the East Bay, was murdered this year. And there's been an outcrying from the community speaking out against violence. Certainly Brandy is not the only person we have lost this year at all. We continue to have violence, especially targeting our trans women of color, that we need to deal with and stop. And we also experience the over-incarceration of trans women, especially. CeCe McDonald, who somebody called into the room right now, is in prison because she actually stood up to her attackers. And there's a lot of organizing going on to try to get her out of jail. So obviously our work isn't done. Having laws on the books are great, but we need to figure out how do we do the harder work in some ways of public education, to share who we are, what we need, and to create a different view of what is possible for trans and gender nonconforming people in the world. I do think we're going to get employment protections. I actually do think we're going to get health care. But that doesn't mean we get safety or security. And that's where we need to figure out how, as trans people and trans organizers, we work together to create the world we want to live in, where all of us come together and are able to have a better quality of life together. So what is that going to take? I will say there used to be a year, at least 10 years ago, maybe even less, where I felt like I knew almost everything happening around trans rights and trans organizing in the country. There were only really, it felt like, a few of us doing work in different cities across the state. What's neat is that has changed. There is so much local organizing happening at the grassroots level that it's almost impossible for any of us to know everything going on these days. And I'm incredibly excited about that, because I think what's going to really make the difference is for those of us who can to be out. Because if people don't know us, it's hard for them to love us, because they only see what Fox News puts out there. So especially those of us who are able to safely be ourselves and be out about our experience, to live well, to do well at whatever we do, it makes it much easier for people to see us as people. And, yeah. And we know historically that those of us sometimes that have had some of the most, quote, successful transitions, those of us who can live safely, those of us who have had good jobs and good paychecks, have sometimes been those of us who have been the most closeted and the most afraid of being out. And I get it. I do. Because in many ways, our goal is to be our authentic selves. And as a man who has a transgender history and is a proud trans man, I understand the interest and desire sometimes to just be seen as a guy. Any of you know what I mean? Sometimes it is exhausting to come out all the time, especially knowing that you may be seen as different or have additional threats when you do. And yet I am convinced that is the only way we are going to continue to move forward. Because I think the policy advocates and the lawyers are doing about as good of a job as they can, getting laws on the books. And now it is really about changing hearts and minds. And that happens when we are out and active. And a lot of you are. Y'all wouldn't be here if you weren't willing to be out to some extent, right? And there is just an explosion of work going on. I could not count the number of trans organizations and groups in the country at this point, which is really frickin' cool. This is just a snapshot of some of the work that's happening. And what's neat about it, I think, is it's such a wide array of work, focusing on different communities, based on the needs of those communities, and the strengths of those communities. So is Marissa here? Marissa Richmond from Tennessee. Marissa Richmond has been organizing for years now to change Tennessee. And if some of y'all think it's hard to be in California and trans, Marissa is on the front lines, out fighting the good fight against really difficult circumstances. Every day. And it is making a difference, yes? It's not easy, but it's making a difference. And fighting some of the attacks that they are experiencing in Tennessee to even have their local non-discrimination laws recognized. There's been an incredible program out of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition called I Am, and Gunner's back there. Gunner, will you put your hand up? It's worth checking out the website around I Am, because I think they've been doing a great job asking trans people to share their stories from around the country and putting them up online so people know who we are and the real challenges and assets and gifts that we bring to everyday life. And has been really helpful as they're doing some of their advocacy work out in Massachusetts. Gunner and Jesse and a bunch of folks too have been putting together a trans advocacy network, and they've got a track here this weekend, networking some of the local and the state trans groups, because there is so much going on, we all risk recreating the wheel. And we have a lot to learn from each other. I mean, I know when I go to trans gatherings, I am always amazed by brilliant ideas I never would have had. I am amazed, recently I've been going to, when I can, to connect with international trans advocates, especially since Argentina passed a law that we couldn't even imagine in the United States. You know, in Argentina now, just in the last year, you can get a legal gender change from the country regardless of your medical status. And you also can get transition-related care paid for by the government. And it's done because they believe in a right of identity. A right of identity. Can you imagine what it would be like in the United States if we said, yes, I have a right of identity? We have a lot to learn. And we have a lot to learn from other countries, and we have a lot to learn from other states and from each other. There's great work happening in family law, and as I'm sure many of you are seeing in your local areas, an explosion of parents of transgender kids who want to stand up for their children. And these parents are fierce advocates. You want to create change, you want to get somebody like to fix something, get a parent on the issue. Nobody's going to mess with the mama. And I actually think for many of us, and I say this to myself as well, I think that's an untapped resource in our community. These parents are organizing. They're organizing amongst themselves, they're organizing with their kids, and many of them though are talking to each other, and we've not tapped into them in many areas. So I think that's something we need to think about. How do we mobilize this? The power of the parent, because it's out there. At Transgender Law Center, as an aside, now the beginning of every school year and before camp, we get all of these calls from parents. That wasn't happening a few years ago. It's pretty neat.
Mason?
Yeah.
Is it possible to invite them to the next summit?
Folks want a parent track at the next summit?
Yeah.
I bet we can make that happen.
Fab.
And then there are these employment programs happening, which I'm thrilled to see. Chicago, DC, Los Angeles, with Rian running the TEAT program out of the LA University. And here in San Francisco, we have TEI, the Transgender Economic Empowerment Initiative. And I would love to see these replicated across the country to figure out what are the unique employment challenges we're having, especially for trans people who have not had access to the same education or employment experience because of family rejection, school challenges and harassment, or the fact that we just simply have references that we can't use from our prior lives. These folks are really helping a range of folks, both the people who are coming out later in life with a PhD and a strong work experience they can barely talk about, to trans folk who have been growing up on the streets and are trying to figure out how to get in the job market. We have some great folks who are doing work on these programs, and I believe actually there's even resource out there if we want to start doing some replication. These are the kinds of programs that are going to take these laws that are happening on the ground and actually making them real for folks. So Nevada, I know you all have had some incredible work going on. New Mexico is organizing, and a lot of these folks are here this weekend. So please connect with each other, learn from each other, because if you have great training over here, that saves time for me because I don't need to develop it, right? Like, let's figure out these ideas and share them. And if you have a trans group and you're not a part of the Trans Advocacy Network, I'll do a little plug, please join. Because they're creating a pretty great, robust website for all of us to share trainings and materials and policies so that we don't have to start from scratch.
And it's free.
And it's free. So another thing that happened this week is for the first time ever, However, we successfully defeated an anti-equality ballot proposition in Minnesota, and we affirmatively won marriage rights in 3 states. It's a first. Now this is good for us, for our trans folk there, because the questions about whether or not marriages are valid before or after transition are in large part resolved when same-sex marriage is the law of the land, because it just makes it a little easier for folks. But I think there's a bigger and too, it shows we've got a power as a movement that's working. We're learning how to win. I love that. There's also, though, a question it raises. I believe we are going to see the end of the marriage debate. I think employment laws are going to be resolved soon. I think healthcare can be resolved, and I think marriage is going to be resolved. You think that can happen?
Yeah.
So what's that going to look like afterwards? How many folks are going to continue to do LGBT organizing if we have employment protections and we have marriage? And we've resolved don't ask, don't tell. How many of us are continuing to be in the fight? I love the hands. Because we're not going to be done. And what I think that trans organizers need to think about is, what's our world going to look like when most of the mainstream gay and lesbian and bisexual agenda is met? And it's time to start having that conversation. Now, on the plus side, and there are a lot of pluses, right? We like wins, and when the tide rises, all of us rise with it. But not everybody rises at the same rate. So what is it going to look like when marriage is no longer an issue? Now, one thing that I think is a potential benefit is that a lot of the financial resources that have gone into the marriage debate, I think we have the potential to do education about why trans folks still have a lot of work to do, and to see if we can get some of those resources into trans groups nationwide. Because we've still got a lot of work to do. 2, I think a lot of advocates, donors, and groups are going to be figuring out what's the next big thing for them. And trans rights can be seen as that next big thing. Vice President Biden said, right? Trans equality is the big fight of our generation, of our time. And I'm going to admit that I have a bias. I have a couple biases. One bias is I want to make sure that trans groups are able to benefit from that change. I want to make sure that the trans groups and the folks who've been doing this work for 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 years are able to get lifted up by this tide. Because I believe the folks who are in this room and doing the work around the country know best what trans folk in your areas need. So as the mainstream LGBT equality groups are asked what they're going to do about trans issues and are funded to do trans issues, I want to make sure that you all in your groups are right there beside them. If we're not, I fear that we can go in a direction that's not actually led by the community. And every movement lets us know we will be stronger and we will get to our destination with more people intact if we listen to our communities. So it's, I think, a conversation we need to have with each other. How do we inform what the mainstream LGBT agenda looks like, especially as more groups are looking at trans issues as the next big thing? It's great for us in so many ways. And I want to make sure that the great work that you all are doing is recognized and elevated with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Woo! So, for some of you who are going to the fundraising track later, we're going to talk about some of this, and how do we tell the story about trans folk and make sure that our groups are growing. Because we have a lot of groups to support out there, and many of these folks are still doing work with duct tape and dental floss. Volunteer sweat, maybe a half-time staff person, maybe if you're lucky a couple of staff, but many of us are still severely under-resourced for the big changes we're trying to bring in the world. And if we're successful, we are not just going to be alone, because many of us are going to be doing work in a way that really promotes economic and racial justice, because we have to. That's who we are. And that's what we need. So one other thing I just want to bring up as far as trends. I mentioned I can see a light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to transition-related care. I don't think that's a short path, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. As some of you may have seen in the news just this week, the City of San Francisco's Health Commission voted to remove transgender exclusions from Healthy San Francisco, which is our local program for underserved residents. And because they realized that they didn't have experts in-house to do all of the healthcare procedures some of us might need, they are creating also a specific gender transition program to build the capacity and competency to do a range of transition-related services that many of us may need. So that's going to be happening over the next couple of years. With the Affordable Care Act, there may be a pathway to make sure that many of us have care when we haven't before. Medicaid is going to be expanded, so those of us who are low income may actually have the chance to have a medical home for the first time. For those of us who are middle income, many of us will be able to get subsidized health care coverage through state exchanges that are being set up in every state around the country. And for those states that don't want to do it, there'll be a federal exchange. So many of us are going to get into health care for the first time. And with an end to pre-existing conditions, those of us who've been told, no, we can't cover you or you can't get that, have potentially a pathway to getting the care that we need. And then with programs like this, even people who are uninsured or low income can have some level of equitable access to coverage. It's a pretty neat day. But this is not going to be easy. I put this up here because this was Fox News headline last night. Gender spenders, we kind of love that. San Francisco to put the bill for sex changes. We have been so successful over the last 10 years that most people in America have no idea how successful the trans movement has been. Because we've also been really successful being quiet. Now, we've had really public figures out there being out as trans, which has really helped people see that we exist. But a lot of our most strategic and most difficult wins have been because the activists have been very quiet about it. And it's time for us to come out. The days of doing things quietly without people noticing it are coming to an end. I think that's going to be increasingly the case when the right-wing and anti-equality voices do not have the marriage battle to point to. In some ways, marriage has been a bit of a distraction because that has been the flashpoint for people who want to use gay and lesbian people as a wedge. And what we have to be really careful of is increasingly, I think, we're going to see transgender people used as a wedge, and we can't let that happen. It means we need to be really smart as we're doing work together and have as much solidarity with ourselves, with the LGBT movement, with other social justice movements as we can, because we will be much stronger together. And we need to realize, too, that the right wing is going to start paying attention. And they are going to be vitriolic at times. And I worry about that for our kids. So the more we can support our children, especially and each other, the better. I say this because when marriage was put on the ballot around same-sex marriage on the East Coast the first time, I think it was in Massachusetts, one thing they noticed is every year there was a same-sex ballot initiative, youth suicides among LGBT youth went up. Because they would see all of this messaging from anti-equality folks around marriage debates, and it was internalized. They would say, oh my gosh, this is what people are saying about me as a young gay or lesbian or bisexual child. And suicide rates, each year there was a same-sex ballot initiative, went up. I say this because as the right wing pays more attention to trans issues, we need to really pay attention to ourselves and our own mental health. Because it is not easy to be trans. It is not always easy to love someone who is trans. And when we see dangerous and hate-filled messages out there, it is easily to internalize them, even when we feel like we've been through everything you could go through. So it's time for us to really take care of each other and ourselves, too. And to think about the young kids, whether you're a parent of a child, you do school support work, to know that as this becomes more public, there will likely be a downside of that. And we want to be able to figure out how we get the support and the mental health care and caring that we need. At the same time, isn't this kind of cool? Okay, so this was my last slide. So here's what I want to do, is take a minute, actually literally a minute, and I want you, to the person next to you, to share one thing you are excited about over the next couple of years when it comes to trans rights and equality, and one thing you're scared of. Can you do that really quickly?